Racist Karen calls 911 when black man closes his own pool, but she had no idea what he found out. James had always been the kind of person who preferred to handle things himself. As a homeowner, he liked to take care of his house and yard, making sure everything was in order. It was the middle of autumn, and the weather was starting to cool down. For James, this meant it was time to close his pool. He knew that if he didn't take care of it now, he would be facing more problems down the line when the cold winter weather arrived. On this particular Saturday, James was focused on the task at hand. The sun was still high in the sky, but the temperature had already dropped enough that he could feel the chill in the air. He had on his old work gloves and a hoodie as he moved around the yard, preparing the pool for winter. His movements were methodical, each action a familiar routine that he had followed for years. James didn't mind the physical labor. It was part of owning a house. Plus, it gave him a sense of satisfaction to know that he could handle things himself without having to call anyone for help. He enjoyed the peacefulness of his neighborhood and the privacy that came with having a large backyard. The sounds of the neighborhood were always the same: children playing, dogs barking, the distant hum of traffic. It was a safe place, or so he thought. James had been living in his house for 5 years now. The neighborhood, which was mostly made up of families, had been quiet and welcoming when he first moved in. Over time, however, things had started to change. There had been new neighbors moving in, and not everyone was as friendly or understanding as he had hoped. But James brushed it off. People would be people, and as long as they didn't bother him, he wouldn't bother them. As James worked, he glanced around the yard. The pool cover was just about ready to go on. He was almost finished. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath of the cool air. The faint smell of autumn leaves filled the air as they drifted to the ground. He thought about how this neighborhood used to feel like a close-knit community, but lately he had noticed a few more stares and whispers than he was used to. It wasn't enough to make him feel uncomfortable, not yet anyway. But it was there, and he couldn't ignore it. Out of the corner of his eye, James noticed movement from his neighbor's house. Karen, a woman who lived a few doors down, was standing in her front window watching him. She had always been a bit of a busybody. James had seen her peering out of her window more times than he could count, observing what was going on in the neighborhood. It didn't bother him too much. It was just part of her nature. But today, something felt different. Karen was in her late 50s, always wearing neat clothes that seemed a little too formal for a suburban neighborhood. Her house was well kept, but there was a coldness to it, as though she didn't want anyone getting too close. James had always said hello when they crossed paths, but her responses were often curt and rushed. She had never been particularly friendly, but James had always given her the benefit of the doubt. People were different, and he wasn't going to judge her for her reserved demeanor. Today, though, James noticed something strange. Karen wasn't just standing by the window looking out. She was watching him intently, her eyes fixed on him as he worked in his yard. She had a look on her face that James couldn't quite place. It wasn't just curiosity, it seemed suspicious, even though there was no reason for it. James shook his head and went back to his work. He didn't want to overthink things. People sometimes watched others when they were doing something unfamiliar, and maybe Karen just didn't understand why he was closing his pool so early in the season. Some people didn't know much about pool maintenance, and they might think it was odd to do it in the fall rather than waiting until the end of the year. But James had learned from experience that waiting too long could cause damage to the pool, and he didn't want to deal with that. It was when he began to lower the pool cover into place that he saw Karen move away from the window. He thought nothing of it, continuing with his task. But within moments, he noticed her standing at the edge of her property, just outside her front door. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was holding her phone, her eyes darting from her phone to James's yard. He felt a strange unease settle in his stomach, but he shrugged it off. Maybe she was just texting someone. It wasn't a big deal. However, the moment James finished covering the pool and began gathering his tools, he heard the distinct sound of a car pulling up. Glancing over, he saw a police car rolling down his street, slowly coming to a stop in front of his house. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he had a sinking feeling in his gut. He watched as the police car parked at the curb, the officer inside rolling down the window to look at him. James paused for a moment, trying to understand what was going on. The officer got out of the car and approached him slowly, his footsteps crunching the fallen leaves on the ground. James wasn't nervous. He had done nothing wrong, after all, but the unexpected visit made him feel uneasy. "Can I help you, officer?" James asked, keeping his tone calm. The officer, a man in his 40s with a stern face, raised his eyebrows. "Are you the owner of this property?" he asked. James nodded, still unsure where this was heading. "Yes, I am. What's the problem?" The officer paused for a moment, seemingly hesitant. "We received a call about some suspicious activity. A woman reported something unusual going on here." James's confusion deepened. "Suspicious activity? I'm just closing my pool for the season. It's a normal task." The officer looked at him for a moment before speaking again. "That's what we're trying to figure out. I'm just doing my job, sir. Can you explain what's going on?" James's mind raced. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was simply working in his own yard, trying to get the pool ready for winter. He had no idea why anyone would find that suspicious, but there was no denying that something had triggered a response from the police. He could only imagine that it had something to do with his neighbor, Karen. He explained once again, a bit more firmly this time, that he was merely taking care of his property. He showed the officer the pool equipment and the cover, even pointing out that it was a routine task he had done for years. The officer seemed to listen, but there was a slight tension in the air, as if the situation was being treated with more suspicion than it should have been. James realized that Karen must have called the police, and the thought made his blood boil. He had no idea what she had told them, but it was clear that she had overreacted. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He had the right to be in his own yard, doing what was necessary to take care of his property. The officer looked at him a bit longer, as if waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. James's patience was beginning to wear thin. He couldn't help but feel that Karen's actions were more about her prejudice than anything else. James stood there, his mind racing as the officer listened to his explanation. He tried to remain calm, but the situation felt increasingly strange. He couldn't shake the feeling that this had something to do with his neighbor, Karen, who had been watching him from her window earlier. His initial suspicions seemed to be right. The officer's skeptical expression and the way he was taking his time to process the situation only confirmed his fears. It wasn't just about closing his pool. It felt like something more was going on. The officer's silence was unsettling. James had been perfectly polite, explaining every detail of his actions, but it seemed like the officer wasn't entirely convinced. James shifted on his feet, wondering if the officer was just doing his job or if there was something else behind this visit. The officer cleared his throat and spoke again. "I need to confirm a few things, sir. We got a call from a neighbor saying there was suspicious activity. It's not common to see people closing their pools so early in the season." James took a deep breath. "I understand. But this is routine for me. I've lived here for years, and every fall I close the pool myself. I've never had a problem before." He could feel his patience starting to slip, but he didn't want to escalate things. The officer seemed to relax a little at that, though his eyes still scanned James's yard, almost as if searching for something out of place. James wasn't sure if it was the officer's doubt or the lingering tension in the air that made everything feel uncomfortable. "I understand," the officer said slowly, writing something down in his notebook. "But I still have to ask, why is the pool cover already on? It's still early autumn. Some people wait until November to do that." James could feel his frustration building, but he kept his voice steady. "I've been doing this for years. It's just how I've always handled it. I take care of my property, and that's all. The weather can be unpredictable, and I don't want to risk damage to the pool equipment." The officer nodded, though his gaze didn't entirely soften. "Okay, I see, but we still need to confirm a few things with your neighbor, and I'll check the records for the house. We just have to follow up on every call." James didn't argue. He understood that the officer had a job to do, but this was starting to feel like an unnecessary intrusion. As the officer turned to walk back to his patrol car, James noticed that he glanced over at Karen's house, where she was still standing by the window, watching the exchange unfold. James couldn't help but feel a rush of irritation. Karen had never been the friendliest neighbor. She always seemed to have something to say about the people around her, often in whispers or judgmental glances. He had never paid much attention to her before, but now he couldn't ignore the fact that she had clearly made a call to the police. and that call had led to this strange interaction. He knew Karen didn't know him well. She likely had no idea about the hours he'd spent maintaining his property, fixing things that needed attention, and generally making sure his home was in good shape. Instead, it seemed like all she saw was a black man in his yard, doing something she didn't understand. And that, James thought, was the problem. As he stood there waiting for the officer to return, James's mind drifted back to his earlier thoughts. He had noticed the subtle shifts in the neighborhood over the past few months. More people were moving in, some of them making strange comments or staring at him as he went about his business. The feeling of being watched had been growing, but it wasn't until today that he felt it more intensely. Karen's call to the police wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was about how she viewed him, based on nothing more than assumptions. His thoughts were interrupted by the officer's return. He walked back up the driveway with a more relaxed expression, though there was still an air of caution in his steps. "The records check out," the officer said, his voice softer now. "The property is registered in your name. It looks like you're in the clear, but I still need to speak to your neighbor." He glanced over at Karen's house again, his eyes narrowing slightly. James felt a knot of unease in his stomach. "Go ahead," he said, trying to sound unaffected. "But I don't understand why she called you. I'm just closing my pool." The officer hesitated, then nodded. "I'll talk to her, but please understand people get nervous sometimes. It's my job to follow up even when it's a misunderstanding." James wasn't sure if the officer truly understood, but he didn't press the issue. As the officer made his way toward Karen's house, James stood still, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He watched the officer ring the doorbell, and for a moment, everything seemed to hang in the air. James could see Karen's shadow moving behind the curtains. He knew she was watching from inside, probably waiting to see how things played out. From where he stood, he couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw Karen open the door and speak to the officer. Her body language was tense, her arms crossed defensively. James didn't need to hear the words to know that she was probably trying to explain herself, justifying her actions. What did she think was so suspicious about him closing his pool? It wasn't long before the officer turned and walked back toward James. This time his expression was more neutral, though there was a hint of frustration in his eyes. "I've spoken with her," the officer said, his voice low. "She's insisting that she saw something unusual, but it's clear there's no crime happening here. She thought you were doing something odd, but she didn't give much detail on why." James didn't know whether to laugh or to feel even more frustrated. "It's just my pool, that's it. She must have thought I was up to something because of, well, who I am." The officer didn't respond right away, as if he didn't want to admit what they both already knew. Finally, he said, "She's not going to be calling about this again, but I'll be filing a report just so everything's on record. That's standard procedure." James nodded, feeling a little relieved but still unsettled. "I understand." The officer gave him one last look, his demeanor softening just a little. "Take care of yourself, sir, and be careful with how others see things. It's not always fair, but it's something we have to deal with." James watched the officer walk back to his patrol car and drive off, leaving him standing alone in his yard. The pool cover was now secure, but the uneasy feeling in his chest lingered. It wasn't just about the pool. It was about how things had changed around him, how the world outside his yard seemed to view him differently. As James turned to head back inside, he glanced up at Karen's house one last time. She was no longer at the window, but he knew she had been watching, just as she always did. And now, the tension between them felt heavier than ever. He wasn't sure what he was going to do about it, but one thing was clear. Things would never be the same. As the days went by after the unsettling encounter with the police, James couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in his neighborhood. The incident with Karen and the police had left a strange tension in the air. It wasn't just the fact that she had called the authorities for something as mundane as him closing his pool. It was how everything had unfolded. James had lived in this neighborhood for 5 years, and though he had seen changes over time, this situation made him feel like an outsider in his own home. He had never been one to dwell on the opinions of others, but this time was different. The next few days felt long. James had been doing his best to focus on his work and get back to his routine, but every time he stepped outside, he couldn't help but feel like eyes were on him. He noticed more subtle stares from neighbors who had always been friendly before. Some people waved as they passed, but the smiles seemed strained, as if they were unsure how to act around him now. It was like a cloud had settled over his once peaceful neighborhood, and he was unsure how to clear it away. At first, James didn't make a big deal about it. He tried to tell himself that things would go back to normal. After all, the officer had confirmed that everything he did was perfectly legal. There was no reason for him to feel like he had done something wrong. But every time he stepped outside, he couldn't ignore the feeling that Karen had put something in motion that he couldn't control. Her call to the police had stirred something up that wasn't easily put back into place. On a particularly quiet afternoon, James was in his garage, organizing his tools and equipment. The weather had turned colder, and he was getting ready to make sure everything was in good condition for the winter. As he was moving a box of extra pool supplies to the back of the garage, he heard a car pull up outside. Glancing up, he saw a familiar face. It was his neighbor, Mark, who lived a few houses down. James hadn't spoken much to him, but they had exchanged pleasantries in the past. Mark was in his mid-40s, a quiet man with a kind demeanor. "Hey, James," Mark called out as he got out of his car. James paused for a moment before responding, a little surprised by the visit. "Oh, hey, Mark, what's up?" Mark gave a slight smile but looked slightly hesitant. "I've been meaning to talk to you," he said, taking a few steps toward the garage. "I heard about what happened the other day with the police." James's stomach tightened. He wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but he knew it had to do with Karen. "Yeah," James replied, his voice neutral. "It was a misunderstanding, just me closing the pool, nothing more to it." Mark nodded, but his expression remained serious. "I just wanted to say, I don't know if you know this, but Karen's been spreading some pretty harsh rumors about you lately. She's been telling people she was concerned about you doing suspicious things." James felt a sharp pang in his chest. He had suspected something like this might be happening, but hearing it confirmed made him feel uneasy. "What kind of rumors?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Nothing specific, but she's been telling people she's worried about what you're doing over here," Mark said, his voice low. "She said things like he's always out there working on the property, and who knows what he's really doing." It's been a little uncomfortable, to be honest. Some of the neighbors are talking. James's frustration bubbled up inside him. He had never done anything wrong. He had always tried to be a good neighbor, never causing trouble or making waves. Yet here was Karen, creating a narrative that painted him as a threat for no reason other than his race. James took a deep breath and clenched his fists, trying to control his emotions. "I'm just trying to take care of my house, Mark. I've been here for years, and now this. This is happening. I don't know what to do." Mark nodded sympathetically, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "I get it. It's not fair. I know it's not easy to deal with this kind of thing, but you should know not everyone is on her side. A lot of us don't buy into the stuff she's saying." James felt a small sense of relief at Mark's words. It wasn't much, but it was something. It reminded him that not everyone shared Karen's narrow view of things. Still, the damage had been done. Karen had planted the seed of suspicion, and even if some of the neighbors didn't believe her, it was hard to undo the harm that had already been caused. "I appreciate you telling me this, Mark," James said, his voice sincere. "It means a lot to know that some people see it for what it is. But what about Karen? What's she been saying to the others?" Mark hesitated, looking over his shoulder as if to make sure no one was listening. "She's been trying to convince people that you're dangerous or that you're up to something shady. I don't know exactly what she's been telling them, but she's been persistent. It's like she's making sure everyone's on alert about you." James shook his head in disbelief. "That's crazy. I've never even spoken to her more than a handful of times. I don't understand." "I know, man," Mark said, his voice softer now. "It's messed up, but honestly, I don't think she's going to stop anytime soon. She's the type who's determined to see things her way, no matter what." James's mind raced as he processed Mark's words. The feeling of being targeted because of someone's narrow-minded assumptions was something he had dealt with before, but it had never felt as direct as this. Karen wasn't just whispering behind his back. She was actively trying to turn the neighborhood against him, making him out to be someone he was. He stood there for a moment, trying to figure out how he should handle it. He didn't want to create a bigger problem, but at the same time, he couldn't just ignore what was happening. It wasn't just about the pool anymore. It was about his reputation, his place in the community, and his right to live without being unfairly judged. "Thanks, Mark," James finally said, forcing a small smile. "I'll figure it out. I appreciate you talking to me about it." Mark nodded, though his expression was full of concern. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. I've got your back, man." As Mark left, James couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the small amount of support he had. But even as he walked back into his house, he knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. Corinne's words had already done their damage, and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, he knew that he couldn't just let this go. He had to take action, but how? James's mind was filled with a whirlwind of thoughts. He knew that the next step had to be careful. He didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily, but he also knew that silence could sometimes be interpreted as weakness. This wasn't just about him. It was about standing up for what was right. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a burning determination to make things right, not just for himself, but for everyone who might be unfairly judged because of someone else's prejudice. James spent the next few days thinking about what Mark had said. The conversation had stuck with him, and it wasn't just the fact that Corinne had been spreading rumors about him. It was the deeper implications of what it all meant. Why had she felt the need to call the police? Why had she chosen to target him? Was it something he had done, or was it simply because of how she saw him? The more he thought about it, the more frustrated he became. It wasn't just about a misunderstanding anymore. It was about something deeper, something far more troubling. As the days passed, James couldn't ignore the tension that had settled over his neighborhood. People who had once waved at him from across the street now avoided his gaze. Neighbors who had once chatted with him in passing were suddenly too busy to stop and talk. The silence felt deafening. It was clear that Corinne's words had caused more than just a little ripple in the community. It felt like the very fabric of the place had been shaken, and James was left wondering if he was ever truly a part of it. He spent a lot of time outside, trying to keep his mind busy with small tasks. The yard was tidy, but that didn't bring him peace. He found himself looking over at Corinne's house, her window still positioned in such a way that he could see the faint outline of her silhouette, always watching, always observing. He had started to resent that feeling, the feeling of being under constant scrutiny. He had never signed up for this, never asked for this type of attention. It was as if his mere existence had become a point of suspicion. One afternoon, while James was trimming some hedges in his front yard, he saw Corinne walk past his house. She didn't look at him directly, but he could feel her gaze shift towards him as she walked by. It was subtle, but it was there. He didn't know if she was just trying to avoid confrontation or if she was simply too proud to acknowledge the situation she had created. Either way, James knew he couldn't let this go on any longer. As the week went by, he began to make plans. He couldn't keep quiet about this, not anymore. He had tried to brush it off, telling himself that things would eventually go back to normal. But it was becoming clearer by the day that things weren't going to change unless he took action. He needed to address the situation, and he needed to do it in a way that would make it clear that this type of treatment wouldn't be tolerated. James knew that confronting Corinne directly would be difficult, but he also knew that it was necessary. He had to make her understand that her actions had consequences, and that she couldn't just go around spreading lies without facing the repercussions. But he wasn't going to do it with anger. He was determined to handle it calmly, with a level head. The truth was on his side, and he had to trust that. It was on a crisp Saturday morning that James decided to take the first step. He walked over to Corinne's house, taking slow, deliberate steps. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he was determined to remain calm. As he approached her front door, he took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. He had no idea how this conversation would go, but he knew he had to try. A few moments later, the door opened, and there she was, Corinne, standing in the doorway with an expression that was a mixture of surprise and wariness. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there looking at him. James could feel the weight of the moment. "Hi, Corinne," he said, trying to sound casual. "I wanted to talk to you about something." She raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by his visit. "What is it, James?" Her tone was stiff, and she didn't invite him in, but James didn't expect her to. "I just wanted to clear something up," he continued, his voice steady. "The other day, when you called the police, I don't think you understood what was really going on. I was just closing my pool, that's all, nothing more, nothing less." Corinne's face tightened, but she didn't interrupt him. She just stood there, listening. "I get it," James said, trying to keep the conversation calm. Maybe you were concerned. But what I don't understand is why you felt the need to involve the police. It felt like you were making assumptions about me without even giving me a chance to explain myself. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but then closed it again, looking away for a moment. It was clear she wasn't used to being challenged like this, and James could tell she was trying to figure out what to say. I didn't mean to cause any trouble, she finally said, but her voice lacked sincerity. I was just trying to look out for the neighborhood. James felt a rush of frustration but controlled it. I understand that, but you have to understand how this looks from my perspective. I'm doing my job as a homeowner taking care of my property and you call the police on me. That sends a message that's unfair. Karen shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze. I didn't think it would go that far, I just thought. Well, I thought something was off. Off, James echoed, his voice rising slightly. Karen, I've lived here for years. I've never caused any trouble, and now you're trying to paint me as some kind of threat for no reason. How is that fair? Karen flinched at the word threat, and James immediately regretted saying it. But the words were out, and they had landed. She took a deep breath, seemingly trying to compose herself. I didn't mean for it to be like this, she said, finally looking at him. I don't know, I guess I've just heard things, and I was worried. James shook his head, trying to keep his emotions in check. Worried about what exactly? What things have you heard? Because I can assure you I've never done anything wrong here. I've been nothing but a good neighbor, and all I'm asking is for the same respect in return. For the first time, Karen looked slightly ashamed. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was clear that she was processing what James had said, and for the first time in their interactions, she seemed to be listening. I don't want any trouble, James said, his voice softening. But I do want an apology, not just to me but to everyone who might have heard your rumors, because that's not how neighbors should treat each other. Karen stood there in silence for a moment, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, she sighed and finally spoke. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to cause all this, I don't know what I was thinking. James nodded, still feeling a mix of emotions. This wasn't an apology that would erase everything, but it was a start. It was a small step toward clearing the air, and that was all he could hope for in this moment. I appreciate that, James said. But just know, Karen, that this kind of thing can have a lasting effect. I'm not the only one who's been affected by what you've said, and I'm not going to let this happen again. With that, he turned and walked away from her doorstep, feeling a sense of finality in his chest. He didn't know if Karen would ever truly understand the weight of what she had done, but he knew that he had stood up for himself. And that was all that mattered. The following days after James's conversation with Karen felt strangely different. There was a sense of quiet in the neighborhood, like a tension had lifted, but the air was still thick with unspoken thoughts. James didn't expect an instant change. After all, Karen's actions had caused a ripple effect that couldn't be easily undone. But the fact that he had spoken up and confronted her gave him a sense of control, a small victory in the face of unfair treatment. It was a step forward, and though it didn't erase everything, it did provide a glimmer of hope that things might start to improve. James went about his daily routine, focusing on his work and spending time outdoors, trying to shake off the lingering discomfort that still followed him. But each time he saw Karen, there was a sense of unease. She would look away quickly when their paths crossed, as if avoiding confrontation, but the awkwardness was palpable. James wasn't sure if this was the start of a quieter, more respectful relationship, or if it was just a temporary lull before the storm. Only time would tell. One afternoon, while James was mowing his lawn, he noticed Mark walking down the street toward him. Mark had been one of the few people who had reached out to him after the incident, offering support and reassurance. James had appreciated that more than he could say. As Mark approached, James waved, smiling. Hey, Mark, how's it going? James called out. Mark smiled back, but his expression was serious. I wanted to check in with you, he said as he reached James. See how you're holding up after everything that happened with Karen. James paused for a moment, turning off the mower. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and took a deep breath. I'm doing okay, considering everything, but I'll admit it's been a little tense around here. Mark nodded, his gaze thoughtful. Yeah, I get that. People are starting to talk, and not all of it is good. Karen's been telling a different story about what happened, and it's not sitting right with me. James felt a jolt of frustration. "What do you mean?" he asked, already anticipating the worst. "She's been telling people that she was just trying to help, and that she didn't know it would escalate the way it did," Mark explained. "But she's been saying things like you're the type of person who doesn't belong in the neighborhood. I don't know how much you've heard, but it's been bothering me." James's heart sank. It was one thing to hear Karen's words directly, but hearing about them from someone else made them feel all the more real. The fact that she was still spinning a narrative, trying to justify her actions, made James feel like he hadn't been heard at all. "I can't believe she's still saying that," James muttered under his breath, frustration building inside him. Mark placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to offer some comfort. "I'm not telling you this to make things worse. I just want you to know what's been going on behind the scenes. I don't think it's fair for you to be left out of the loop." James took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "I appreciate you telling me, Mark. But it's like every time I think things are starting to calm down, she finds a way to stir things back up." Mark gave him a sympathetic look. "I know, it's a tough situation, but you've got to know that not everyone thinks the way she does. You've got support here, even if it doesn't always feel like it." James nodded slowly. "Thanks, I really need to hear that. I just don't get it. I've done nothing wrong. I was just trying to live my life, take care of my property, and all of a sudden I'm the target of someone's assumptions. I've never felt so out of place in my own neighborhood." Mark sighed, his eyes softening. "It's hard, man. People like Karen don't understand what they're doing when they make these assumptions. They don't realize the damage they're causing. But I'll tell you this, you don't have to face this alone. If you ever need someone to back you up, I've got your back. We've all got your back." James appreciated Mark's words more than he could express. "Thanks, Mark. That means more than you know." After their conversation, James couldn't help but feel a mixture of emotions. On one hand, he was grateful for the support, but on the other hand, he was still deeply frustrated. He had been living in this neighborhood for years, and yet it felt like the moment something went wrong, he was suddenly treated as an outsider, a suspect. It was an exhausting feeling, one that he hadn't anticipated when he first moved in. As the days went on, the rumors seemed to quiet down. The neighborhood, once full of whispers, began to feel a little less tense. James was cautiously optimistic that the situation had started to settle. But every time he saw Karen, he was reminded of how things had changed. The lingering resentment in the air was hard to ignore, even as people began to return to their normal routines. One morning, as James was on his way to the store, he noticed a small group of neighbors gathered outside, chatting amongst themselves. He recognized a few of them from previous encounters. As he approached, one of them, Sally, waved him over. "Hey, James. Come join us," she called out with a smile. James hesitated for a moment, unsure if this was a conversation he wanted to be a part of. He had never been one to shy away from people, but with everything that had happened, he wasn't sure if he was ready to jump into another awkward interaction. Still, he decided it was better to face things head-on. "Sure, I'll come over," he said, walking toward the group. As he joined the group, he noticed that they were talking about the weather and some minor neighborhood issues. It felt like a normal conversation, and for a moment, James relaxed, enjoying the simple conversation. But then, Sally spoke up. "You know, I've heard a lot of people talking lately, and I just wanted to say that we all know what happened with Karen, and it wasn't right. I just want you to know that not everyone around here thinks the way she does." James felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Thanks, Sally. I really appreciate you saying that." Another neighbor, Tom, chimed in. "Yeah, we all know how she can get sometimes. Don't let her get to you. We've all got your back." For the first time in weeks, James felt like he was part of the community again. It wasn't that the rumors had completely disappeared, but hearing people speak up and offer their support gave him a renewed sense of belonging. It wasn't just about the things Karen had said. It was about the people who were willing to stand by him, to make it clear that they didn't buy into her narrative. As the conversation continued, James found himself more at ease, laughing along with his neighbors. It was a small step, but it was progress. He realized that in the end, it wasn't just about Karen or the rumors she spread. It was about the way people chose to respond to them. He couldn't control what Karen said, but he could control how he handled the situation. And with the support of those who truly understood him, he knew he didn't have to face this alone. The sun was setting as James walked back to his house, feeling lighter than he had in days. There was still work to be done. He couldn't forget the damage that had been caused, but for the first time in a while, he felt a sense of peace. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about standing up for himself and finding strength in the people around him. As he stepped inside, he took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next. He knew that no matter what, he had made his stand, and that was something no one could take away from him. As the weeks passed, things in James's neighborhood slowly began to return to normal. The tension that had once hung in the air felt a little lighter now, but the scars of the incident with Karen were still present. James had faced the uncomfortable reality of being judged, but he had also learned a great deal about himself and the people around him. He had learned that not everyone would jump to conclusions, and that sometimes standing up for yourself was the only way to clear the air. One evening, after a long day of work, James decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the houses. It was a beautiful evening, and as he walked, he reflected on how far he had come since the incident. He no longer felt like an outsider in his own home, but there were still moments when he couldn't ignore the quiet whispers that lingered in the corners of his mind. As he walked past Karen's house, he saw her standing in her front yard. She wasn't looking at him directly, but he could tell she had noticed him. Their eyes met for just a brief moment, and in that instant, everything felt like it was frozen in time. James took a deep breath, his steps slowing. He had to admit that he still wasn't sure how to feel about Karen. She had caused so much unnecessary stress, yet she had also been the one to finally acknowledge her mistake, however begrudgingly. He could have easily walked on, pretending not to notice her, but something inside him told him that this moment was important. He had spent weeks stewing over what had happened, and perhaps this was the moment to let it go. To truly move forward, he needed to be the one to make peace, even if it wasn't perfect. James stopped in front of her house, not quite sure of what he was going to say. Karen looked up at him, a faint, almost apologetic expression on her face. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, as if she was unsure of how to approach him now. "James," she said quietly, her voice softer than he had ever heard it before. I wanted to apologize again. I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened. I know I acted out of line, and I'm truly sorry for that." James looked at her for a long moment. There was something in her tone that made him believe she was being genuine this time. He had heard her apologize before, but it hadn't felt real. This time, it felt different. Maybe it was the way she said it, or maybe it was the fact that she wasn't hiding behind excuses. Either way, James felt a weight lift off his chest. "I appreciate you saying that, Karen," he replied, his voice steady. "But I want you to know that it wasn't just about the pool. It was about the way you judged me without even getting to know me. You assumed things about me that weren't true, and that's what hurt the most." Karen nodded, her eyes downcast. "I know, and I'm sorry for that. I've been so quick to judge people before, and I shouldn't have done that to you. I don't know what came over me. I saw you in your yard, and I let my own fears and assumptions take over." James could see the sincerity in her eyes. She wasn't making excuses anymore. She was owning up to her actions, and that made all the difference. "I understand," James said, "but I think we both know it's not just about me. It's about how we see each other as neighbors, as people. We can't just go around assuming the worst about each other based on what we think we know." Karen looked up at him then, her expression softening. "You're right," she admitted. "I've spent too much time trying to control everything around me, trying to protect myself from what I don't understand. But you're right. We have to be more open to one another, and I want to try to do that. I don't want things to be awkward between us anymore." James smiled slightly, feeling the tension ease in his chest. "I appreciate that," he said, his voice quieter now. "I think we both could have handled things better, but maybe this is a chance to start fresh." Karen gave a small, almost hesitant smile, and for the first time James saw a hint of the person behind the walls she had put up. "I hope so," she said. "I really do." The conversation, though short, felt like the beginning of something new. James wasn't sure if this meant they would become best friends or even just occasional acquaintances, but that wasn't the point. The point was that they had both acknowledged the tension between them and had taken the first step toward moving past it. James realized that, in some ways, this was more than he had hoped for. It wasn't about winning an argument or proving a point. It was about understanding each other better and trying to do better in the future. As James continued his walk through the neighborhood, he felt a renewed sense of peace. The weight he had been carrying around had finally begun to lift. Things wouldn't go back to how they were before. Things rarely did after an event like this. But he was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be better. People could change. They could learn. And sometimes, the hardest thing was just taking that first step to admit when you were wrong. Later that evening, James sat on his porch, watching the sky fade from gold to purple as the stars began to appear. He thought about everything that had happened, the frustration, the confusion, the hurt. But he also thought about the good things, the support from his friends and neighbors, the chance to speak up for himself, and the possibility of moving forward without carrying the burden of resentment. He realized that he had taken control of his own story, and that was a powerful feeling. As the night settled in and the neighborhood grew quieter, James felt a deep sense of contentment. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but he knew that he had done his part to heal the wounds that had been caused. He had spoken his truth, he had been heard, and he had made peace with his neighbor. And in the end, that was all he could really ask for.